I'd now like to introduce today's presenters, starting with our team at Everest Group. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Guru, is co-founder of Everest Group's research practice. He is responsible for guiding the practice's research agenda and architecture, as well as aligning its capabilities with the market's disruptive changes and next-generation demands. Anurag Srivastava, Vice President, leads Everest Group's locations research practice. With over 14 years in research and advisory services, he is a recognized expert on the Europe service delivery landscape and a frequent speaker in various industry events throughout Europe. Parul Jain, Practice Director, leads the firm's research and advisory work for locations and workforce optimization. She is actively involved in thought leadership development on next generation themes for shared services, such as digitalization and innovation. And now to introduce our guest executives. Mukul Gupta is an executive director at JP Morgan Chase & Company and leads the Global Location Strategy Program as part of Global Workforce Strategy. Prior to JP Morgan, Mukul worked at Citigroup for 3 years and at Morgan Stanley for over 13 years. In various roles over the years as a transformation specialist, Mukul designed, led, and drove numerous change management, process improvement, and global resource and location strategy initiatives. He has been involved in many global optimization programs across different technology and operation clients and has worked closely with global third-party service providers worldwide. Alexander Lizensko is Chief Operating Officer at ING Business Shared Services. For over 2 decades, he's worked for ING in Russia, Czech Republic, and Amsterdam in various operations and IT positions, including country CIO, COO, and regional COO, with the current focus being sourcing. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Michael Jansen to kick things off for us today. Take it away, Michael.
All right, thank you, and good morning from nice sunny Dallas. I think most of you recognize Everest Group for having lots and lots of data and doing fantastic analysis, really robust insights. Today we're going to do some of that, but we're going to do it a little differently. We've got 2 esteemed guest panelists here that we want to actually spend more time talking with them. So we're going to start the webinar with a couple data slides, a handful, and then we're going to drive into the discussion. And what we're really trying to get to is what are some of those overall forces that are driving disruptions in the location strategies. So I think we all know where India is at, but what's changing the locations and what are people thinking about as they look forward into 2020? Anurag?
Yes, so thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. So we also wanted to touch upon what are those key sources for today's webinars, and this is specifically for the first section on top trends that we're seeing in the global delivery locations landscape. So it is based on our publications such as Market Vista. So this is a quarterly publication within which this webinar is being organized. It also banks on a lot of our custom and syndicated research across multiple topics that you see on the right. So we cover research on locations optimization topics. We go fairly deep on the IT services side, on the business services side, and also then we specialize on covering the GIC, or Global In-House Center or Shared Services landscape. So the first section is based on our coverage of activity and center setup activity across all of these different lines. The one thing I wanted to point out is one of our larger reports on the locations strategy side. Our Global Locations Annual Report is going to come out in early September, so keep an eye out for that one.
All right, thank you. And so we're not going to go through the 100-page report today. We're going to go through a handful of slides, and then we're going to go through our discussion, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. So you can enter your questions into the webinar panel, and we'll address those as we can, and we'll specifically get to any of the more complicated or more discussion-oriented toward the very end. So with that, let me introduce Parul, and she's going to take us through some of the key insights from the data.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. So The last 12 to 18 months have been particularly interesting from a global services standpoint. The market has witnessed growth on all frontiers, be it in terms of new center setup, revenue growth, FTE or headcount growth overall. What we see here is a chart depicting the rate, the number of new center setups, that is the net new addition to the global services capacity. This excludes the expansions of existing centers, but focuses more on the new centers in set up all across the offshore, nearshore global services locations. Now, what exactly is driving this growth? We are seeing that as companies are reevaluating their location strategies in light of evolving market forces, changing customer expectations, and pressures of market consolidation, there are multiple interesting dimensions for growth. So there are a lot of enterprises that are setting up new centers for more strategic judgment-oriented work such as engineering, R&D, digital services, cybersecurity, analytics, etc. More so, there is rebalancing of portfolios that's happening. Enterprises are bringing critical pieces of work in-house while they continue to outsource the non-critical activities. Going forward, we expect the market to continue with the momentum and build further. Now, we looked at that the growth is strong. On the next page, we now look at how the contours of this how the contours of growth break down between the different sourcing models. GICs, as we described, are global in-house centers, the shared services back offices captives, as known as also the GCCs. Service providers are the third-party providers, basically the outsourcing construct. Overall, if we look at the GIC market, the share of GICs has been consistently growing. There's a higher skew towards the GIC. Specifically, if you look in the last 12 to 18 months, the share has increased from 53% to 65%. Now, this trend is also a manifestation of how GICs are evolving to a more strategic position in the sourcing portfolio of enterprises. We believe this is driven by 3 to 4 key factors. One, GICs are demonstrating the capability to up the ante, drive end-to-end ownership, and deliver top-line impact. Then there's also a shifting preference of enterprises, a more intentional one, towards leveraging the in-house model more for strategic judgment-oriented work where they can command a higher degree of control. Specifically in IT, we see an increasing adoption of agile DevOps over traditional waterfall methodology, which results in stronger need for co-location to ensure seamless process continuity. Even in cases for business process services, companies have a preference to retain their secret sauce, which basically differentiates them from their competitors and move towards a GIC model. In the subsequent pages, we now look at how these trends pan out when you talk about different geographies and functions. This page talks about how the delivery and growth breaks out by different regions. Asia Pacific covers India, Philippines, China, Singapore, and other Southeast Asian countries. Nearshore Europe includes the nearshore UK, namely Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Central Eastern European countries like Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, Hungary, etc. Latin America and the Caribbean include South America and the Caribbean islands, and others primarily correspond to the countries in Middle East and Africa. Net that if you see, we're seeing the dominant geography, Asia Pacific, continue to be strong and thriving, especially in terms of locations. We see growth in India and Singapore, specifically for R&D and engineering work. Nearshore Europe continues to witness growth. In fact, it is the region with witnessed highest growth across all and is being increasingly leveraged as a go-to location for IT and multilingual work. In a way, both these regions, Asia Pacific and Nearshore Europe, are not competitive but complementary to each other. As we've also seen in some of our clients' work as well, they're leveraging their distinct centers in both these regions to support differentiated functions and processes. On the next page, we further peel the onion to understand how the functional models are evolving across each of these regions. What we see here are 3 different charts depicting the functional mix for all of these corresponding regions. A common thread which runs across all the regions is that the engineering R&D segment continues to witness the maximum growth, especially in Asia Pacific region. This segment has experienced a tremendous boost with many players setting up R&D centers to develop data-driven, intelligent, and robust systems using RPA, cloud, and AI-based capabilities. Even if we were to reflect back, many companies started their offshoring, nearshoring journey with traditional processes like F&A, HR, IT, and it only makes a logical step now to expand, leverage their well-entrenched network base, and support more complex work. The share of BPS, the business process services, which includes both voice and non-voice work, has been facing a continuous decline in terms of share in new center setups. In Latin America, a particularly interesting trend is around the increasing share of IT services, which basically we're seeing more trend picking up in locations like Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Costa Rica. We've discussed various trends by slicing and dicing the data. Now let's look at the key locations, or hotspots as we call it, experiencing significant global services activity. What we've done here is basically looked at the top locations that are witnessing growth, not only in terms of new center setups, but also expansions, overall global services growth, and categorized them into three key buckets. The first bucket is what we call as leaders. They're characterized as highly mature, established locations with a thriving in a global services activity. So locations like India, Singapore, Poland, Philippines, China. Most of these locations are witnessing growth on the next generation themes such as digital, R&D, etc. Specifically in China and Poland, we're seeing growth for cloud infrastructure and artificial intelligence related applications. The second bucket is called as the major contenders. These are the second rank locations with medium maturity but are witnessing high growth. The locations like Ireland, which witnesses growth on the engineering and F&A side, locations like Portugal, which we are seeing interest on the IT and next-gen technology side, Romania, particularly interesting from a multilingual capability and expanding on the IT front into cybersecurity side. The third bucket is the aspirants or the dark horses, which are basically relatively nascent when it comes to maturity, but are witnessing a surge in growth. So the likes of Lithuania and Israel, very high, very good activity on the R&D engineering side. For Jamaica, we're seeing a significant uptick in the English language-based voice business processes side. So net, what we've done is kind of laid out the key locations that are witnessing key maximum growth and should be on the locations radar of strategy professionals. Now, so far, we've looked at the changes, the trends in offshore, nearshore geographies. Let's also look at how the reshoring mix, the onshore-offshore dynamics have changed. So what we did is we picked up a bouquet of leading 25 service providers and analyzed their new center setup activity. Interestingly, with each year, we're seeing a skew towards the onshore setups, onshore geographies, almost like a reversal of trend. Right from 23% in 2015 to almost 3x in 2018-19. Now, key point to note here is that while the number of new centers might be higher on onshore geographies, however, the size per center, that is the headcount in each center, is relatively lower in onshore as compared to the offshore centers. But just talking about the overall trend, why the center setups in onshore has been increasing relative to offshore, we believe there are three key reasons. First, things around new data security regulations like introduction of GDPR in 2018 had created mandates for processing of data, leading to players reconsidering their locations portfolio. Secondly, following the H-1B reforms in the United States, multiple countries like Singapore, Australia have made their visa norms tighter, thus propagating a higher number of center setups in onshore geographies. Thirdly, increased pressure from buyers to grow onshore presence for just ease of coordination, better alignment, training, and promoting customer intimacy. With that, I'll move on. I'll hand it over to Anurag for taking us through the next piece.
Thanks, Parul. At this point, thanks for walking through the first section, very interesting trends. I wanted to actually bring our panelists on the take here and see. So we've covered a fair bit of trends around continuing growth in offshore and nearshore markets. On the last slide, we also saw that growth continues to happen in the onshore markets, and as a proxy, we used the top 25 bellwether kind of service providers. And we see that there's a lot of growth now driven by digital or engineering or R&D kind of work. How much does that resonate with what's happening in your organizations? Alexander, if I can pick your brain first.
Sorry. Was disconnected.
We can hear you now.
Yeah. So can you please again repeat, because I was disconnected for a second.
Yes, Alexander. So the question was really, so we've looked at the first section now and seen that the key trends are around growth continuing to happen from a new center, new service delivery capacity setup perspective. We see that digital and engineering and some of these judgment-oriented work is now driving a lot of centers of excellence and new center setup. And there's also a lot of growth now happening in onshore geographies. And we use the top 25 service providers as a proxy. Do you see a lot of these trends are manifesting themselves in your organization as well? So do they resonate, or are there some things that are different in your organization?
Yes, we see the difference. I would say nearshoring becomes more pronounced. We see that we are now concentrating more knowledge-based processes and processes that are closer to our customer services and to our clients, and that requires more business proximity that we can get if we place resources, say, on the other side of the globe. But at the same time, the trend to offshore, traditional scope of offshoring is continuing. So I would say we're not slowing down, but at the same time, we see a pickup or faster growth of the nearshore centers in our case.
So offshore and nearshore growing in complementary fashion, and I'm assuming there's some growth onshore as well happening, or is onshore growth slowing down and that is now leading to more growth offshore and nearshore?
No, so both are growing, but the main factor here is that artificial intelligence, natural language processing, robotics, they really change the type of qualifications that we are looking at. So that's why this is, I would say, the main factor for us today that changes these dynamics. So we need less people to do processing as such. I'm looking more for business analytics, this type of profiles. And since this area is for us is not maybe very mature yet, we are not yet ready to immediately offshore it. So that's why for us we move in stages, and at first develop these shared capabilities closer to business in Europe. And at certain stage we might consider sort of moving the back end of it to offshore.
Got it. Okay. And Mukul, if I put that same question to you, so what parts of this resonate well with you and what parts seem fairly different from how they're developing in your organization?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be on the panel with some of us who've lived this journey in the last 2 decades. So Anurag, I would answer in 2 parts, right? As far as the trends are concerned, everything does resonate, right? It does resonate that, through 15, 16, we saw a spike. We ourselves as JP Morgan, all of this is public knowledge. We've seeded, Warsaw as a location and built on a lot of our global existing corporate centers. We don't like to use the word service centers because I think they're absolutely integrated into our DNA as an organization. So we are seeing those trends, right? And to Alexander's point, being the bank we are, again, one of the largest banks in the world, more North America, wholesale globally, retail more locally. It puts a different spin to how we operate, right? So the top of the house, I would say, we've got 10 global corporate centers and 10 large domestic corporate centers. So we are fairly well balanced in our onshoring and non-US footprint. What I will say is that there are three broad parameters, right, which have kind of, which as Parul laid this out, right, more from a global location strategy or sourcing strategy perspective, have been the drivers, right? I would bucket those in three parts. I think the U.S. election and Brexit have been big disruptors in the industry, right? Talking about disruption. So that's something that does continuously stay on the radar and drive some of our decisions. The other thing is also the socioeconomic parameters of the world have changed, right? So we've seen hypergrowth in over the last decade, especially last 5-6 years, and the Indias and the Chinas and Southeast Asia of the world, which means a lot of global players are expanding their footprint, which is also driving decisions on location strategy, which are integrated not just from service delivery perspective, but local business, regional support perspective as well. And it's a very key decision factor in some of those. And the last thing, right, is the technology trends, right? The digital, the AI, the robotics. That's a big disruptor within our own ecosystem as well, because that's a lot of productivity that right now. You can talk about agile as an operating model, and we can then talk about productivity impacts of automation as a disruptor itself. So we are seeing definitely these trends, very well-balanced approach between onshoring and, farshoring. But as far as labor market capability is concerned, we don't see any constraints, whether it's our India platform, Philippines, Singapore, or any of our EMEA platform. We think some of these latest technology trends are global, and we are thinking of these labor markets who've proven themselves all over the last couple of decades as being absolutely fair share from where we can tap talent. So they are at the center of our location strategy, not an afterthought.
Got it. Thanks a lot for your opinions. With that, I hand it over to Michael to set up the panel discussion. Michael?
All right, fantastic. So let's move into the conversation around some of the disruptions. And we started to go down that path in these questions. The way we're going to do it is in three kind of blocks. We're going to talk about some changing internal dynamics. We're going to talk about some environmental forces, and then we're going to bring in some wild cards, some of the things that are potentially going to be something we got to think about as we move forward here. So with that, I think we got one more chart here we're going to show you on the next page. Okay, so this is from our we actually pulled two different studies together to bring the data together on one page here. And the question we asked both service providers and enterprises, how they thought the it's kind of an internal power shift was changing. So we asked the question around what was the
I guess Michael has got locked out, so I can possibly cover this page. So essentially, what we asked our respondents was, and we asked enterprises and service providers separately around what are the key buying centers they see, and what we plotted on the chart was what is the percentage increase in budget by all of these budget holders or these buying centers, right? And interestingly, most of it can be plotted on a single line, as you can see on the page. And so what we saw was there was alignment between enterprises and service providers on what budget centers they saw increasing in influence in the organization, right? And so what is interesting here is that if you look at the top right, edge of the chart, the chief digital officer and the technology head of business units are gaining more budget influence in the opinion of both enterprises internally, but also service providers that essentially work with these budget centers day in, day out, right? That is fairly interesting for us, given that these two functions essentially represent what you would call a change the bank or change the organization kind of function. Whereas on what is outside that green circle or in the lower budget increase category are functions that are typically you're operating and running the, keeping the lights on kind of function, right? So you have COO, you have CFO, you have shared services there, and operations head of BUs there. So that is an interesting trend. I think what we wanted to take away from this on the next page, which is our first point that we want to cover in the internal dynamics, is how does that change what workforce demands are being placed to the fulfillment or supply side, right? So when you try to deliver or change the organization function, how does that change where you want to be in location strategy? So Mukul, so Alexander, you covered this to some extent, but feel free to add more. Mukul, if you can go first on what does this mean for skills of the future, and what does it mean for where you're operating and where you want to operate in the future?
Sure. Thanks, Anurag. So I'll say a few things here, right? So the workforce demand has changed. And as I was saying, right, there are increasing trends. We look at this as a fair share of the world labor market, right? I don't think the India, the China, the Poland of the world need to prove themselves at all anymore in terms of their service capability or the capability of the workforce. What is interesting is that, from some of these locations, the workforce mix itself has changed, right? So there's a workforce mix component, there's a technology aspect, and then there is a workplace aspect. And those three things, right, are things that we need to keep in mind when we think of workforce demand. From an internal demand perspective, which is the whole cost and margin pressure point, there continues to be more and more need to optimize locations and optimize budgets. But from a supply perspective, right, in the workforce mix perspective, right, when we look at global service centers, global corporate centers, the average age of our workforce is much less as it compares to the business centers, right? The Londons and the New Yorks and the Tokyos of the world, right? The average workforce age is much higher than, so that leads to interesting dynamics on two fronts. One, how are we attracting this talent? Because there's enough of, and they are much in demand in their local markets. Secondly, more importantly, how are we influencing the workforce mix? Because you also need to see the DNA of the organization. So we pay particular attention to that workforce mix and how we are addressing, right, the organizational mix in it. The second piece is obviously technology, right? And when I say technology, I'm not talking about the domains of technology which are in demand, which is like the AIs, robotics, clouds, big data, cyber, digital, anything you can talk about, right? Those are decision factors which lead to location selection. But as far as workforce demands, what it means is that technology really has eliminated the whole physical proximity, distance proximity, time zone piece, right? I know we touched a little bit on agile, right? And Alexander talked about it. What I've seen is over all of our global location and corporate centers, right, whether it's internationally or domestically, many, in agile terms, the garage is being set up where pretty much it's the same look and feel, and that's the whole branding exercise. It's the whole branding exercise and how we want to do the culture carrying of the organization, but also just the interaction is very, very seamless. So that's actually really, really enabled us to make some really bold location strategy decisions. And the last thing I would say is, the workplace, right? So the workforce demand is also a function of workplace. And what I mean by that is you really need to invest in, the cool and more collaborative workspaces rather than the traditional historical, cube style, isolated or, segregated workspaces. I think the workplace is a lot more collaborative, and those go into workplace strategy design as well. I bring workplace into it is because from our perspective, it's at the center of the table rather than after fact. Gone are the days of, let's lift and shift and we'll worry about optimization and then the workforce and then the workplace, right? I think it's all come up front as a core part of location strategy. That's what I would say, Anurag, in terms of how we think about it.
Okay. Thanks, Mukul. Alexander, anything to add in terms of the demands from a changing, what you want to do in your shared services perspective and how that is affecting you in terms of where you want to be and where you want to grow?
Well, I agree with Mukul's points. I would add maybe a regulation aspect to it as well, since, I work in a bank, it's highly regulated industry, and we see that placing certain type of activities outside of the legal space of the regulator, that actually for us, the regulator is European Central Bank, creates additional control levels that we have to meet, which makes it a bit more costly and more difficult to achieve. So that's one more factor when we think what to place where. So in this respect, for us, it's certain activities it's easier to place in Europe than say in Asia. That would be an additional factor. And since regulation burden overall is significant, I would say this is one of the factors that drive it. If you look at the spend and whose budgets are getting bigger, I would say digital, yes, but the question is, where do you apply digital? So from this perspective, so regulation and meeting the regulation and compliance became a big factor. So we concentrate comparatively to previous years. Relative portion of budget goes in this direction, and automation and digitization of this area.
Right. And if I were to quiz you on the point of cost and margin pressure, Alexander, so are there also internal pressures around, let's say, a cost target that is being set either on a per FT basis or total for your shared services organization? Is there a margin pressure that, obviously there is a workforce pressure which is, making you change? Is there also a hard target number that is affecting that change and is a forcing mechanism for you?
I wouldn't say that there is a hard target, but clearly cost is always a factor. So you cannot ignore it. So that's why labor arbitrage is still a factor. However, if you look at our particular situation, today the quality of the workforce and the compliance and ability to actually acquire talent and retain it in the numbers that we need is actually dominating factor.
Got it. So in many ways, then the quality of talent and being able to drive innovation within shared services is the primary driver of location strategy, and not. I mean, to a large extent, cost arbitrage is still there in the background, but that's become more like table stakes or a basic need. The driving factor and the key field is the innovation and quality of talent, quality of work. Correct. That lends itself nicely to the next driver that we wanted to talk about, which is more external threats, moving on from the internal ones, which is where we want to cover both changes in the geopolitical background, such as the new four-letter word, and then we have the regulatory changes and natural hazards. So I think, Mukul, if you can talk about, given that you have operations in Europe and you have centers in Scotland, Ireland, Poland, how are you looking at the Brexit disruption, and then how does that change how you think about allocating work between the three nearshore centers, and what roles will they continue to play and compared to what they are doing right now?
Sure, Anurag. So I'll come to Brexit in just a minute. But before I go to Brexit, right, I think the geopolitical piece has been quite a journey for all of us, right, over especially the last 4 years, right? So there's the U.S. elections that change, our geopolitical landscape. The latest U.S.-China, saga and the tweeting of every day is a disruption, right, or a distractor, I should say. And then there are all the elections in so-called emerging markets or the big service centers or labor markets of the world, like India, like the Indo-Pak, India-Pakistan tensions that have been there, or the Argentinian elections, right? So these, again, there are a lot of geopolitical factors. I wouldn't want to say Brexit is, although Brexit is at the heart of a lot of disruption. So the point here is, it's been quite a journey, and we think of it quite holistically. Coming to Brexit in particular, right? So being the global bank we are, and we've been on this journey for quite a while, right? And it's improved every year in terms of how we've been thinking about it. Brexit was quite well thought through. And when I say that, right, in the past, right, a disruption like that or an unknown like that or a wild card like that, right, would have been, let's wait for the dust to settle and then we'll react from a location or a workforce strategy perspective. What we did differently, right, as we've been looking at Brexit and working with the businesses, is that putting the location strategy at the center of that design, right? So business will do and will need to do what they need to do, right? Whether it's going to other business centers within Europe or looking at how new products are going to be launched. And again, it's public knowledge that, we are a large global wholesale bank, and our investment banking business and asset management business is big in EMEA. So we are very closely tied in the hip with those decisions that business is making to say what is the right workforce and location strategy. Fortunately for us, right, we have sizable footprint in EMEA, right, outside of London, or outside of the business centers. So we do have the Poland play, we do have the Scotland play, we do have the Ireland play, and what we've been doing is these centers have matured as well. Warsaw is the newest one of the lot for us, right? So we seeded that about 3 years ago, and we've just seen really great demand just because of the great labor market that is. The key here now is that it is at the center of a lot of decisions from a workforce perspective when it comes to how our investment banking business or asset management is looking to solve for Brexit. Rather than a reaction, it's more proactive in action. So that's been our approach, and it's been a huge success, right? I mean, we are on a growth pattern. Obviously, so are all our competitors. With the news, Citi is big there, Goldman's big there, and I think a lot of global corporations are looking at these markets, right, being right in the center of discussion when they're thinking of Brexit. Especially we are.
Got it. Okay. The other thing that we discussed, Mukul, was the US visa policy that has actually led to, I think, in some ways led to the service providers ramping up onshore. But also we see that large enterprises are actually even offshoring large programs, given the inability to find talent in the US with the same ease as they had earlier. Has that had an impact on your operations in the US, and how has that impacted you?
Sure. So that's a multi-loaded question, Anurag. And I'll try and make it simple. I'm sure colleagues who've seen this space, especially evolve, will completely understand or it'll resonate with them. So there are three parts to it, right? One is the third-party service provider piece, right? I think it obviously has impacted them because they cannot bring a lot of US visas given the limitations. And what they're realizing is, they need to find local talent, right? So they need to hire local talent. So that's their driver. From a global bank that we are, our perspective, right? There are two parts to it. One is we do feel that there's enough in our labor market, and as a globally responsible and a socially responsible bank, right? We got to build our base. We have a really strong footprint in 10 of the largest cities in America, so we can build on our brand, build on our fair share of the labor market play, and build that capability. The other thing that has been, and I alluded to this earlier, is the global socioeconomic parameter, right? So what we are realizing is that, a lot of and we're looking at this from two aspects. One is, as I said, it's not just important to scale in our global locations or global service centers, as we call it, right? Or global corporate centers, which is the Indias and the Philippines and the Warsaws and the Buenos Aireses of the world. What is also important is to see the organizational cultural carriers and the DNA and the senior leadership, right? So we are seeing there is a lot of internal demand where, professionals are willing to go back either to their native countries or people looking for mobility options. So again, this is some internal dynamics, but it comes into play a lot more with these external disruptive environmental forces like the US policy. So that's kind of what we're seeing. And yes, has it had an impact? Absolutely. Is it making the CFOs and the CXOs and the business managers look at this holistic from a workforce strategy? Absolutely. Do I see that it's a healthy thing? Absolutely. Because I do feel that while from an external perspective, it might see as a binding constraint, it is actually leveling out and playing very well to actually seed the management in the right far-shore locations and then balance out the workforce more within the US as well. I think cities like Dallas, cities like Atlanta, cities like Chicago, are seeing a lot more hyper growth because of some of these policies. Does that make sense?
Yes, Mukul. Thanks a lot for that interesting analysis. Alexander, if I were to go to you now to talk about how you see natural hazards and need to ensure business continuity and disaster recovery planning well in advance of any disruption to delivery happening, how has that influenced your both the growth of your portfolio, but also how you decide work placement and where to grow for what kind of skills?
Yeah, so indeed we're comparatively new to sourcing, so we started to do it as a focused exercise only, say, 4 or 5 years ago. And at the beginning, clearly, we were relying at our teams in the countries to act as a natural backup plan or location in case something happens with our offshore team or location. But now we got to the scale of offshore locations where we actually have to start thinking because, well, this old approach might not work in all the cases. And clearly, this probability of natural hazards, also overall, we see that it increased all over the world, but especially so our biggest location in Asia is in the Philippines, in Manila. And clearly, well, they are prone to cases of I don't know, typhoons, and we have to factor it in. So what we're doing now is really going into balancing the workload between Asia and Europe. So depending on the service and its criticality and the comparative size of the team, so we are now looking for a location in Europe that can act in parallel with Manila, so that we have people in hot standby that they can take over in case indeed we lose connection or we lose the site in the Philippines. So that became for us a factor in our location approach, what activities to put where. For us, it's not always easy because, well, compared to our colleagues, we are comparatively small. Yeah, so it's around 55,000 people globally. So that's why for some functions, we do not have enough scale to justify economically to hot standby centers. So that brings additional complexity. But in principle, we're moving in this direction.
And within that entire framework or structure of deciding where and for what processes to build more backup or more continuity, Alexander, are you also seeing that processes that are intended to change the organization or effect transformation, are they gaining more prominence in terms of we need to have backup for this? Is there also that consideration around what processes are actually meant to differentiate us or lead to changes in customer experience, for example, versus processes that are deemed more, transactional or keeping the lights on kind of delivery?
Well, but I would say natural hazards are, first of all, relevant to the continuity of the service as it is today. So the more we get into digital, the more this type of activities become critical for us to sustain the current level of operations. So I would say this goes in balance with what we do and how we do. I wouldn't say that we look for some processes more for natural disasters or not. So we do normal thing like assessing the requirements, so for availability, and depending on this assessment, so clearly highly available services, we look at balancing and to making sure that whatever happens, we are still in business and we can support customers.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. So I think we covered most of the points we wanted to cover on the disruptive environmental forces. With that, I'll hand it back to Michael to run us through the third key disruptive force, which is wildcards, as we call it. Michael?
All right, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, we had a little disruption there of our own with me losing the audio there, but I'm going to go back to Mukul on this one. We've talked about some of the technologies and the impact it's having on the overall organization, the enterprise, if you will, allowing more automation, allowing more productivity out of the existing workforce, but it also changes the nature of the game a little bit. How is it impacting you guys, and what are you guys thinking about as you move forward? Nicole, are you there?
All right, guys. Yeah, so Michael, this is where location strategy meets workforce strategy. That's what I would say, right? So what I mean by that is technology, as it drives the innovation or the automation, more importantly, right, is going to be a disruptor in the overall workforce. So the processes that are automated clearly have a workforce impact, right? And what each business, and I say this more broadly in the industry itself, right, is any thought leader who's driving this, right, doesn't want to become a case study in its own, which means you don't want to have a location strategy which has automation as a driver, as a cause, and the effect is you've overbuilt out because you're going to actually have a lot of productivity kick in after automation has kicked in. So if that makes sense, what I mean is automation is key to our decision, and we are closely tied up with the business, with the CFOs, to say if they are investing in technologies or the automation aspects, right, or the innovation aspects, what is the long-term 3 to 5 year impact on the operations or their workforce strategy before we make decisions on future growth. It's not we are going to actually a run after the whole automation investment growth and technology, and 2, 3, 4 years from now, when the benefits start kicking in of those process optimizations, right, have a lot of scale back because we think, automation doesn't require certain workforce aspects or certain workforce will not be there. So it's a little bit of a dance. It's the way we address this is there's a very close communication process. They are the operation executives, the technology executives, the CFOs are at the table on a monthly basis to discuss the implications and the tracking of that, and that gets into governance. But as far as automation is concerned, it is at the heart of what it's going to impact our workforce with in the coming years. That's how we think about location strategy.
Which technologies are you most excited about?
I think digital is big. I think that's where a lot of investment, Parul talked about that, or when we lost you, we were talking on that slide. I think digital is big, robotics is big, as far as I think cloud is big in the infrastructure space. But those are I would say, the key ones, where we're seeing a lot of investment, right, which will lead to a lot of, improvement and optimization down the road.
Okay, great. Alexander, we were talking earlier about the impact on the applications development and agile on the hub and spoke strategies. And agile implies intimacy. What does that mean to you and what you guys are doing?
Yeah, so maybe just one more thing on robotics or automation as well. We find interesting thing that people, so when we source, it means that we take away the work where it was done before. And when you do robotics, you do the same actually. So the work is going from people to machines. But what we find interesting and that people are more prepared to give away the work to machines rather than to give away the work to people, say, in another location. So that's our approach now is more to first centralize, then automate. We find it as much more efficient. However, clearly people prefer the other way around. So this is our struggle when we talk about automation. But but we still push centralization first and then automation, and means that demand for specialists in automation, in robotics and other related technologies.
I think that's an incredible comment.
Will be there.
Yeah, Alexander, I think that's an incredible comment there. People are more apt to let automation drive down or make productivity improvements rather than give it to some other location. That's interesting.
Yeah.
What about the agile?
So the agile is we are taking agile in application development as much in classical approach as possible. And there clearly we talk about co-location is sort of to a certain extent limits us, because then how do you split? More than that, we're moving into business DevOps, so where we incorporate customer journey experts into the classical application development squads. That adds complexity as well, because these customer journey experts are predominantly in our locations onshore, so we're closer with the business. So we have to work cross-border and here use certain technologies, what Mukul said earlier. So the physical proximity is not a factor, but to a certain extent it still is. It's still a difference to stand next to each other physically rather than to use a video wall or Skype or I don't know the tooling like we're using now. And then we move even further, so not further in parallel, the agile concept we expand to, for example, so how do you run management team meetings of different units? So really management teams are actually having their own obey rooms, and so really apply this agile methods to dealing with the usual management issues and the way they operate. So that's why really rather broad implementation of agile techniques, and say, for example, because of that, we need high demand for agile coaches as well. So that's, again, we're looking where can we find them, and can they work remotely as well. So that brings a lot of fun.
Okay, well, thank you. Nicole, I want to ask one last question here before we run out of time, and I'm going to go back in history, put a little context for this. When we first started doing labor arbitrage to offshore locations, it was all about the cost savings, but there was a side effect of that, which is we moved a lot of our entry-level positions away from the original home office, if you will, and so one of the things about having entry-level positions, it allows people to come in and out of school and learn the ropes, learn corporate, learn the business, and then move up to the ranks. But now that we've created this very global environment, and maybe have we disrupted the pyramid? Is it how are you guys coping with that?
Honestly, Michael, I think we can talk all the strategy we want all our life. If we don't get this right, I feel everything is just reactionary. So for those of us, again, who lived this, probably this resonates, but I'll try and simplify what I just said. The workforce globally has changed as well. As I was alluding to that, earlier part of the meeting, right? We are seeing a lot more talent and a lot higher skilled talent, right, in our global locations. And if we actually still keep the senior leadership and the culture carriers and the DNAs in our business centers, we're kind of losing the plot. Labor arbitrage is a contributing factor, not a driving factor to location strategy decisions. It's not. I'm not saying it's not important. It's highly important. It's what drives CFOs and budgets and all of that. But having said that, right, you have diminishing returns if you don't get the pyramid right. And one of the things we've consciously been working with our CFOs is actually seeing how we get the middle and the senior leadership in our global locations as well. Are we there completely yet? No, it's a journey. Will there always be new players and new businesses as they look at it, get it wrong or get it suboptimal at day one? Probably, which is no different than any new entrant in the market, right? Who's starting the journey, which some of us started 10 years ago. But that's just the journey itself. Short answer to your question: this is at the heart of it. We are constantly working with HR, constantly working with our location leadership to address this, to make sure that the employee pyramids in our global locations, and when I say global, I don't just mean international. I mean everything outside of our New York and the US as well. I mean everything outside of London and India as well. See how we get the middle and the senior leadership and those ratios right. And again, those ratios, when I say middle and senior leadership, is not just our ranks, but it's also other things like our diversity metrics, like our tenures, like our experience levels, like our specialists, like stakeholdership and partnership and seat at the table as well. So we're looking at pyramid in many aspects like that.
No, I absolutely think that's so critical if we're going to continue to develop our young folks in the organization and sustain the culture and thinking about where the future of the organization. I think getting this right, and I think it's not just one pyramid for the U.S. I think you're basically saying we got to have a global pyramid that allows that movement from location to location and role and responsibility.
And Michael, I would say that in some businesses, some parts of the businesses, the center of gravity, the global ownership of those products has actually moved to Asia, to India as well for all of our global products, and that's because the pyramids have gotten right. The ownership has moved. It's not just a service center anymore. It's a global corporate center.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think it can be seen as a single location, and all power and process knowledge emanates from one location. Okay, I think that's where we really are from a time standpoint. Anurag, there's one question that came in from the audience that might be interesting to answer. Do you feel comfortable doing that one?
Yes, so I think we can potentially ask our panelists on that one, right, Michael? So essentially the question is that while banks and especially in East EMEA region in-source some of these activities, and this is specific to things like business analysts, project managers, scrum masters. I think this is more IT or app development or consulting kind of work. Big providers have often been able to still be in the forefront of these deals given their local presence. I think the question is, are you seeing that there's some reliance on niche providers that do not have large global portfolios? So is that driven more by, the quality of the, services that these providers can offer for smaller providers, or are there different workforce models that are emerging, Mukul and Alexander, that enable you to actually collaborate with smaller providers more effectively, even if they, let's say, don't have or they're not co-located with you? So is technology, for example, changing that ability to work with smaller providers? So I know it's a jumble of questions, but I wanted to get your reactions before we close. Alexander, if you can go first.
Well, I think it really depends on the area. If it's a niche area, if it's more like, I don't know, really new thing or startup thing, really disrupting thing, then clearly we would work with these people no matter their scale. We talk about more stable things, clearly, so they have the cloud, they have the ability, the global capability to deliver talent where we need it and when we need it. So it really depends on what it is exactly. But
got it.
We have all the options.
So we're saying that the contingent workforce still has a fairly big place where it has to fit in your overall strategy of what and how we want to tap into that. Okay.
Yeah.
Mukul, anything that you want to add to this before we close?
No, I think you guys covered it. What I would say is when we think of contingent workforce, domestically it's a staff augmentation. You kind of go into extension model. But when we think of internationally, as Alexander said, right, it is very niche, right? And this goes into global location strategy aspects. In matured markets, you would think of the larger players more as an extension. You wouldn't think of smaller players. But when you think of emerging markets, right, or you're thinking of niche markets like the Tel Avivs of the world, right, or Jamaicas of the world, you are going to go with smaller players because they have a pulse of the market more and are far more than some of the larger global players do. And the TCSs of the world are probably in the same stage or same experience as we are if we're entering into a new market. So the niche players, the smaller players, becoming very, very critical to that partnership.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael.
All right, well, I want to close this out. I want to thank our panelists for an engaging conversation. It certainly brings a lot of dimension to the data that we provide on a day-to-day basis. You can certainly check out our blog for latest perspectives, and there's also a list of related research here that you can tap into. And with that, we'll close, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our team at Everest Group, and especially to our two guest panelists, Mukul and Alexander, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. In addition, please be sure to check out Everest Group's blog and other complementary resources to access their current perspectives on global locations, services, and more. Of course, you may also preview relevant published research on their reports portal, which you can access from the upper right-hand corner of their corporate website. On behalf of the Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.